Welcome to Grim Reality Logs. I am the mysterious nomad. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and leave a like to keep these logs open. Tonight, we are looking at the unique paranoia of the night shift. There is an inherent danger in driving alone in the dark, stepping onto the properties of strangers, and carrying cash with zero protection. You are a moving target, guided only by a set of numbers and the desperate hope that whoever opens the door just wants a warm meal. But sometimes, the address is a lie, and the person waiting in the dark wants something entirely different. Here are 3 terrifying, real-world encounters from the midnight delivery route. It was late October, 1999, and I was working my 3rd consecutive closing shift at a local pizza joint in rural Georgia. The air had that sharp, biting chill that seeped through the thin fabric of my uniform, and the fog was rolling in thick off the fields. It was around 11:30 p.m. when the phone rang with a last-minute order. A large pepperoni to an address on Old Mill Road. My manager, a tired guy named Dave, hesitated before handing me the slip. Old Mill Road was a notorious stretch of uneven, unpaved dirt that wound deep into the heavy pine woods on the county line. There were no streetlights, no other businesses, just miles of dense, suffocating trees. I grabbed the insulated bag, hopped into my beat-up sedan, and started to drive. The further I got from town, the darker the world became. My headlights barely pierced the thick fog, illuminating only a few feet of the rutted dirt road at a time. The radio signal faded out to a low static, leaving me in complete silence except for the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I was looking for mailbox number 842. After what felt like an eternity of creeping along at 15 miles per hour, my headlights caught a rusted, leaning mailbox with the numbers barely visible, spray-painted in faded white. 842. I turned my wheel and eased up the driveway. It was overgrown, with long weeds scraping against the undercarriage of my car. At the end of the path sat a house that looked like it had been abandoned for a decade. The porch roof was sagging, the windows were dark, and there was not a single exterior light on. The only illumination came from the high beams of my car casting long, eerie shadows against the rotting wood. A deep, heavy pit formed in my stomach. Something felt profoundly wrong. I left the engine running, shifted into park, and grabbed the pizza. The silence outside was absolute. No crickets, no whine through the pines. Just a dead, suffocating quiet. I walked up to the edge of the porch, the wooden steps looking too fragile to hold my weight. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and swallowed by the fog. "Pizza delivery." I waited. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Nothing. I took a step back toward my car, planning to just leave the pizza on the hood and go, when I heard it. "Hello. Pizza delivery." I froze. The voice did not come from the house. It came from the dense tree line to my left, about 50 feet away, shrouded in absolute darkness. It was not a question. It was a perfect, flat echo of my exact words. My exact tone. My exact pitch. It sounded like a recording of my own voice being played back to me from the woods. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I stared into the black wall of pines, my eyes straining to find any silhouette. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I have your order." Instantly, the voice responded from the trees. "Is someone there?" "I have your order." The mimicry was flawless, but there was no human emotion behind it. It was completely hollow. Panic flooded my veins. I dropped the pizza box into the dirt and sprinted from my car. As soon as my hand hit the door handle, the silence of the woods shattered. I heard the violent snapping of thick branches and a heavy, thudding sound of large footsteps sprinting through the brush. Whatever was in the trees was charging straight toward the driveway. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I threw the car into reverse and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun in the wet dirt for a terrifying second before catching traction. As the car lurched backward down the overgrown driveway, my headlights swept across the edge of the tree line. Just for a fraction of a second, I saw something tall and impossibly thin standing just beyond the reach of the light. I did not stop backing up until I hit the main dirt road. I threw the car into drive and floored it all the way back to town, completely ignoring the speed limit. When I got back to the store, I was shaking so badly I could barely form words. Dave asked where the pizza was, and I just shook my head and told him I was never going back out there. We tried calling the number on the receipt the next day. The automated operator informed us that the line had been disconnected for over 3 years. To this day, I have never driven down Old Mill Road again, and I still cannot shake the sound of my own voice calling back to me from the dark. Fast forward a few years to mid-January 2004. I had moved to a decaying Rust Belt city in the Midwest, working for a massive chain pizzeria to pay my way through a community college. A brutal winter storm had rolled in that evening, blanketing the cracked streets in a thick, treacherous layer of ice and gray sludge. The temperature had dropped into the single digits, and the heater in my rusted sedan had finally given out, leaving me shivering in my uniform as I navigated the slick, unplowed roads. It was 20 minutes past midnight, right before we stopped taking orders, when the ticket printed out. 2 large meat lovers pizzas and a 2-liter bottle of dark cola going to a massive, brutalist apartment complex on the far edge of the industrial district. This building was notorious among the drivers. It was a towering concrete monolith from the 1970s that was perpetually half-empty, poorly maintained, and completely isolated from any main commercial strips. The drive took nearly 30 minutes due to the black ice. When I finally pulled into the complex parking lot, it was entirely desolate. The towering street lamps in the lot were shattered, leaving the area in oppressive darkness, save for the faint, orange glow of a single security light above the main entrance. I grabbed the heavy insulated bag and the cold bottle of soda, stepping out into the biting wind. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots, the only sound for blocks. The glass double doors of the lobby were smeared with grime. The intercom panel next to the door was completely smashed, wires hanging out like dead veins. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, the magnetic lock on the door was broken. I pulled the heavy handle, and it opened with a loud, metallic groan. The lobby smelled strongly of wet wool, stale tobacco, and an underlying scent of raw ammonia. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting a strobe effect across the cracked linoleum floor. I checked the ticket again. Apartment 404. I walked over to the elevator bank. Only one of the 2 elevators had a lit call button. I pressed it, and somewhere deep in the concrete shaft, heavy gears ground together. It took 2 agonizing minutes for the car to arrive. When the doors slid open, a wave of cold, stagnant air washed over me. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 4th floor, and watched the doors seal shut. As the elevator shuddered upward, the metal box groaned and swayed, making a sound like a submarine descending too deep. The elevator clumped to a halt, and the doors slowly retracted. I stepped out, and my blood immediately ran cold. The 4th floor was entirely unheated. It felt colder inside the hallway than it did out in the parking lot. Half of the overhead lights were completely burned out, leaving long stretches of the corridor in deep, suffocating shadows. The carpet was a dark, stained brown that squished slightly beneath my boots, as if it had suffered a massive water leak that no one ever bothered to clean. Worse than the cold was the state of the doors. As I walked down the hall looking for apartment 404, I noticed that almost every door I passed was sealed shut with heavy plastic sheeting and silver duct tape. There were eviction notices plastered to the peeling paint. This entire wing of the building appeared completely condemned. The silence was absolute. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. At the very end of the corridor, cloaked in the darkest part of the hallway, was apartment 404. I stopped about 10 feet away. The door was not sealed like the others. Instead, it was cracked open about 3 inches. I could not see anything inside. It was a void of pure pitch black. But as my eyes adjusted to the lack of light, I realized there was a single object sitting just inside the doorway. A cheap, wooden folding chair, positioned perfectly to face the gap in the door, pointing directly out into the hallway. My breathing became shallow. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drop the food and run. I tightened my grip on the pizza bag and took one cautious step forward. "Hello," I called out, keeping my voice low. "Pizza delivery. The total is $24.50. There was no movement inside the apartment. No lights flicked on. Just the empty chair facing the crack in the door. I stood there for perhaps 15 seconds, paralyzed by indecision. I was just about to turn around when I heard a heavy, mechanical thud from behind me. I spun around to look down the long hallway. The elevator doors had slid shut, and the digital floor indicator above it had gone completely dark. Someone, somewhere, had cut the power to the car. Before the panic could fully set in, another sound broke the dead silence of the hallway. It came from the heavy metal fire door of the north stairwell, located about 30 feet behind me, right next to the dead elevator. It was the distinct sound of two people whispering. The acoustics of the concrete hallway carried the hushed, burgeoned tones perfectly through the freezing air. The voices were male, gruff, and terrifyingly calm. "Is he down there?" the first voice whispered. "Yeah," the second voice replied. "Go block the south exit. I will flush him out." Pure, unadulterated terror flooded my system. The south exit. That was the stairwell directly behind apartment 404, located at the very end of the dead-end hallway I was currently trapped in. This was not a robbery. This was a coordinated ambush. They had placed the order to an empty floor, cracked the door to keep me standing there, and shut down the elevator. I did not think. I just reacted. I dropped the heavy insulated bag and the 2-liter bottle. The plastic bottle hit the floor with a loud crack, soda fizzing violently onto the damp carpet. I spun around and bolted toward the south stairwell, praying I could reach it before the second man made his way down the stairs to block it off. I sprinted past apartment 404, practically throwing my shoulder into the heavy metal fire door of the south stairwell. It burst open, revealing a pitch-black concrete shaft. I did not care. I threw myself into the darkness, grabbing the rusted metal handrail and launching myself down the concrete steps 3 at a time. My boots slipped on the icy grit covering the stairs, but I caught myself against the rough cinder block wall, tearing the skin off my knuckles. From the floor above me, I heard the heavy fire door slam open against the wall, followed by the sound of heavy boots pounding on the concrete landing. "Hey!" a voice roared, echoing aggressively down the narrow shaft. I did not look back. I plunged down the stairs, blindly navigating the turns in total darkness. 3rd floor. 2nd floor. 1st floor. I hit the ground level landing so hard my knees buckled, but the adrenaline forced me back up. I slammed my hands against the crash bar of the exterior door and burst out into the freezing alley behind the complex. I scrambled through the knee-deep snow, slipping and sliding toward the front parking lot. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and slammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally roared to life. I threw it in reverse, fishtailing wildly out of the parking space, and floored it out of the complex. When I finally reached the police station on the edge of town, I filed a report. 2 officers went to the apartment building to investigate. They found my pizza bag and the spilled soda outside apartment 404, but the hallway was completely empty. When they entered the apartment, they found it entirely vacant, except for the wooden chair facing the door. But what terrified me the most was what the officer told me about the south stairwell. When they checked the exterior door I had burst through to escape into the alley, they found a heavy metal chain and a padlock sitting in the snow right next to the handle. Whoever was coming down those stairs was seconds away from locking me inside the building with them. The final encounter took place in the late autumn of 2012. I was drowning in a sea of medical bills after a long, agonizing illness took my husband from me. With the bank threatening foreclosure on our small home, I took a second job delivering pizzas for a local shop on the edge of the county. I was exhausted, grieving, and entirely numb, operating on a few hours of sleep a night. Because I was desperate for the extra tip money, I always volunteered for the closing shift, taking the late, remote deliveries that the younger drivers refused to touch. It was a Tuesday night, just past midnight, when a massive order came through. 6 large pizzas, wings, and sodas, totaling over $100. The address was for a street called Oak Haven Court, located in a new, upscale suburban development that was still under heavy construction. It was miles away from the main highway, surrounded by acres of empty, cleared farmland. The drive out there was completely pitch black. The further I drove from the city lights, the heavier the isolation felt. When I finally turned onto the newly paved entrance of the development, I realized that the streetlights had not even been wired yet. My headlights washed over towering mounds of excavated dirt, heavy construction machinery, and piles of lumber sitting in the dark. I navigated the winding, muddy streets until I found Oak Haven Court. It was a dead-end cul-de-sac. There were 4 houses on the street, but none of them were finished. They were just skeletal wooden frames wrapped in thin, white plastic weatherproofing. The wind was howling across the flat farmland, catching the loose plastic tarps and snapping them violently against the exposed wooden studs. It sounded like cracking whips in the dark. I pulled up to the curb of lot number 3, which matched the address on the ticket. There was no driveway yet, just a muddy path leading up to the open framing of a massive, 2-story structure. I left my headlights on, pointing toward the skeletal house, and grabbed the 2 heavy thermal bags from my passenger seat. As I stepped out of my car, the cold wind cut right through my thin jacket. The smell of raw pine sawdust and wet mud filled the air. I walked slowly up the muddy path, my boots sinking an inch deep with every step. I stopped at what would eventually be the front porch. There was no door. Just an empty, rectangular doorway leading into a maze of wooden studs and absolute darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly from the cold and the sheer exhaustion. "Pizza delivery." The only answer was the violent flapping of the plastic tarps in the wind. I stood there for 30 seconds, the heavy bags cutting into my hands. My instincts, honed by months of late-night deliveries and a life that had taught me to expect the worst, started screaming at me. There were no cars parked on the street. No portable work lights. No generator running. No crew would be working in pitch blackness at midnight on a Tuesday. This order was a lie. I turned around to head back to my car, and that is when my blood turned to ice water. Rolling silently down the newly paved street, with its headlights completely turned off, was a massive, black luxury sedan. It moved like a shark in dark water. It pulled up directly behind my parked car, blocking me in perfectly. The engine purred with a deep, expensive hum before shutting off entirely. I dropped the pizza bags into the mud. I retreated backward into the dark, unfinished house, slipping behind a wall of wooden studs just as the doors of the black sedan opened. 3 men stepped out into the glow of my car's headlights. 2 of them were massive, wearing heavy leather jackets, scanning the area with practiced efficiency. But the 3rd man, the one who stepped out of the back seat, commanded the space instantly. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit and a long, expensive wool overcoat, leather gloves pulled tight over his hands. He did not look like a street thug or a petty robber. He radiated a cold, overwhelming authority. A powerful man who was used to giving orders that ended lives. He looked at my empty car, still running with the headlights illuminating the mud, and then he looked down at the dropped pizza bags. He gestured toward the unfinished house with one gloved hand, his movements smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Find her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried effortlessly over the wind. A deep, gravelly baritone that offered absolutely no mercy. "Do not make a mess." The 2 large men reached under their jackets and pulled out heavy, suppressed handguns. They stepped onto the muddy path and began walking toward the front of the house. I clamped both hands over my mouth, terrified that my own ragged breathing would give me away. I was standing in what would eventually be the living room. Because there was no drywall, I could see straight through the wooden framing into every other room on the first floor. If they shined a flashlight in my direction, there were no solid walls to hide behind, only vertical beams of pine spaced 16 inches apart. I had to move. I began stepping backward, agonizingly slow, testing the floorboards for loose nails or creaking wood before shifting my weight. The two armed men stepped through the front doorway. The powerful man in the overcoat remained outside, standing perfectly still in the glow of my headlights, lighting a cigarette. The man on the left pulled out a heavy flashlight and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the wooden framing, casting long, cage-like shadows across the subfloor. I ducked down behind a stack of unused drywall sheets leaning against a load-bearing beam. "Check the basement stairs," one of them whispered. The other nodded, his flashlight beam sweeping inches above my head as he moved toward the back of the house. I realized with a crushing wave of despair that they were going to box me in. I was trapped in a wooden cage with armed men, cornered by someone powerful enough to order an ambush just to dispose of a witness or a random target. I crawled on my hands and knees across the sawdust-covered floor, moving toward what looked like the frame of a sliding glass door at the back of the kitchen. The wind held again, snapping a loose tarp against the exterior framing with a loud crack. I used the noise to mask my movements, scrambling through the empty door frame and dropping down 2 feet into the muddy trench of the backyard. I landed on my side in a pool of freezing, muddy water. The shock of the cold nearly made me gasp aloud, but I bit my lip so hard I tasted copper. I laid perfectly flat in the mud, pressing myself against the concrete foundation of the house. Above me, inside the house, I heard heavy boots walking across the subfloor. The flashlight beam swept out the back door frame, illuminating the mud just 3 feet from where my face was pressed into the dirt. "She went out the back," a voice called out from inside. I did not wait to hear the response. I crawled on my stomach through the thick, freezing mud, moving away from the house and toward the open, unlit farmland behind the development. I crawled until my knees and elbows were raw, until I reached a deep drainage ditch at the edge of the property line. I slid down into the ditch, burying myself in the tall, dead weeds, and finally looked back. The powerful man in the overcoat was now standing at the back of the house, looking out into the darkness of the fields. Even from 100 yards away, his silhouette was terrifying. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the cherry glowing bright red in the pitch-black night. He stood there for a full 2 minutes, just staring into the void where I was hiding. Then, he flicked the cigarette into the mud, turned around, and walked back through the skeletal house. A minute later, the red tail lights of the black sedan flared up, and the car reversed smoothly out of the cul-de-sac, vanishing into the night as silently as it had arrived. I stayed in that freezing ditch for 3 hours. I was too terrified to move, too terrified to go back to my car, convinced they were waiting for me in the dark. When the sky finally began to turn a bruised purple with the approaching dawn, I dragged myself out of the mud and walked 3 miles down the dirt road until I reached a gas station and called 911. The police found my car exactly where I left it. They found the pizzas in the mud. But they found no tire tracks from the black sedan, and the phone number used to place the order belonged to a stolen, burner cell phone. The detective told me I was lucky, that whoever had organized that delivery was a professional, and professionals do not usually leave loose ends. I quit my job that morning. I never drove at night again, and I still have nightmares about the cold, calculating stare of the man in the wool coat, waiting in the shadows. That concludes our grim reality for tonight. These encounters serve as a chilling reminder that when you step into the dark, you never truly know who, or what, is waiting on the other side of the door. The isolation of the night shift strips away all the safety nets we take for granted, leaving nothing but you, a dark road, and the unpredictable nature of strangers. Whether it is a voice mimicking your own in the deep woods, a coordinated trap in a decaying building, or a silent, calculated ambush by powerful people in the suburbs, the threat is always real. If you want to keep these logs open, Leave a like and subscribe to Grim Reality Logs. Let me know in the comments which story kept you up tonight. Stay safe.